Hi, I'm John Lundeen. I'm the historian for the Ion Sun Valley, and we're here today at Galena Lodge, which everyone knows is the mountain biking mecca of the valley in the summertime and cross-country facility in the winter. But if we'd been here in the early 1880s, I would be standing in the middle of a town of 800 people that had a smelter, 3 or 4 saloons, 2 hotels, and several houses of prostitution. And today we're going to explore the history of Galena City, as it was known, find out a bit about how it fit in to the overall history of the Wood River Valley. The first thing we have to cover is how Galena got its name. Now, Galena is the name of the ore that's mined here in the Wood River Valley, and it's an amalgam of silver, lead, and zinc bonded together. And that was the predominant metal that brought thousands of people into the Wood River Valley for the silver rush. Now we're actually standing here at the beginning of the silver rush in the Wood River Valley. It started in spring of 1879 when David Ketchum discovered ore at the headwaters of the Big Wood River, which is very close to here. And in May of 1979, Warren Callahan filed for the first claim that was right here at Galena, although to do so in those days, he had to go 85 miles to the county seat located in Rocky Bar. But that was the beginning of not only Galena City, but mining in the Wood River Valley. Now, the town of Galena was settled in 1880. The post office began in May of 1880, which was the first post office in the Wood River Valley, and people started coming here, miners and prospectors, and support for the town. And it grew from that point on. The town itself was actually platted in May of 1881 by Major Hinman, who was a Civil War hero, a lawyer, and a mining engineer, and was involved in early mining here. And the town quickly grew. It ended up with 600 to 800 people, depending on which source you read. It had the first hotel was started in 1879 by Mr. Woolmuth, who also had the livery stable. There were 4 hotels, restaurants, saloons, a shoe store, ultimately a smelter, an ice house, and this was part of the stagecoach route from Ketchum over Galena Pass. One of the saloons here in Galena City advertised it had choice wine and cigars and sold bottled beer from Salt Lake. And prostitution was a realistic part of the cities, the mining cities in those days. And the miners named 2 of the nearby gulches for 2 of their favorite prostitutes, Enid and Emma Gulch, that are still marked on the map here. Now, in July of 1861, a lot of the mining claims changed hands, and outside companies came in and invested large amounts of money. That was true up and down the valley. And in July of 1881, the New York company that owned the Sinop mine decided it wanted to have a smelter here to process the ore before it was shipped out to the outside markets. So they spent $250,000 bringing a smelter all the way from the East Coast by railroad, and they spent between $5,000 and $6,000 improving the road and building new bridges on the road from Ketchum up here to bring the smelter in. The smelter, once it started, employed 200 to 300 people. But unfortunately never worked well, and it was shut down after a few years. And after that, all the ore from Galena City was shipped down to the Philadelphia smelter, located at the head of Warren Springs Canyon in Ketchum. Now, the logistics of mining here were very challenging. Galena City was at 7,400 feet. And the two main mines, the Gladiator mine and Sinop mine, were between 9,000 and 10,000 feet. And they were a couple of miles hike away from Galena City. The miners in those days worked 12-hour days. So they had to start out and end the day hiking several miles up the gulch and then up 2,000 or 3,000 feet of elevation to get to the mines, and then worked underground all day and repeat the hike back. It was a long, tough, difficult way to earn your living, but it was a primary way that people lived here in the 1880s. I'm standing next to Gladiator Creek, about a half-mile east of Galena Lodge, and this is the route the miners would take every day, going to and from Gladiator Mine, which you can see over my right shoulder behind me. You can't see much of the mine, but you can see the light tailings coming down, and that was the residual rock that they mined, and it didn't contain enough ore to take to the smelter, so they threw it away. And these mines were really only operational in the summertime and fall. In the winter, there was much too much snow here, and so many of the miners went south and spent the winter elsewhere. And also in the winter, there's too much snow on the road to transport the ore out of here for transportation to markets outside of the Wood River Valley. I'm standing in front of the historic Galena City stage stop that's presently used as the center for horseback riding for Galena Lodge. This is where the stagecoach that serviced Galena City stopped, and was a very important link to the outside world for Galena City. When the Silver Rush started in 1880 in the Wood River Valley, of course, there were no roads, there were no trails, and the only access was by wagon train or later stagecoach or horseback. After Warren Callahan started his mine here in the spring of 1880, they needed a road. And the Board of Commissioners of Alturas County, where the Big Wood River Valley was located, in May of 1880 decided to build a toll road from Bellevue up to Galena and pay for it out of county funds. A man named Anderson got the contract, and he built the road from Bellevue up to Galena City, and then a very primitive road over Galena Pass to the Sawtooth Valley to provide access to the mines up in the Sawtooth Valley. It's very primitive, but at least it provided access to the north part of the valley and Galena City. The New York company that owned the Sawtooth Mine operated the newly constructed road over Galena Pass as a toll road. And it's interesting to see what they charged. The company charged $1.50 for a wagon with a single span of horses, mule or cattle, 50 cents for each additional span of animals, 75 cents for each additional trailer or wagon, $1.50 for a horse and carriage, $1.50 for each rider and horse, and sheep and pigs cost 5 cents a head. The most important thing that happened in the Wood River Valley in economic terms happened when Union Pacific decided to build a northwest connection from Granger, Wyoming through Idaho to reach Portland. And that was built between 1881 and 84. And they built the Wood River branch from Shoshone into Haley, arriving in May of 1883, and it was extended to Ketchum by August 1884. And that brought a huge economic boom to the Wood River Valley and brought a lot of outside capital to invest in the local mines. Now, as they started building and were coming west, there's a huge demand for railroad ties. And the Wood River Valley provided a significant number of those railroad ties as the Oregon Short Line, its subsidiary, went west. And in 1881 and 82, there were at least 300 men in the Wood River Valley cutting many 100,000 railroad ties that they would float down the Big Wood River and be picked up and used for the railroad construction. And in 1882, there were actually 6 sawmills operating around Galena, cutting wood for not only railroad ties, but also for cribbing and support for the mine shafts that were being built up and down the Wood River Valley. After the railroad arrived in Haley in 1883, stagecoaches were still the primary mode of transportation in the Wood River Valley. They went from Haley, Ketchum, and Bellevue to all the outlying mining areas. And there was daily stagecoach service from Ketchum to Galena And of course, it stopped at this very building where I'm standing now. And the stagecoach went over Galena Pass to access the mines up there, the Sawtooth Mine, Vienna, Alturas Lake, Stanley, and further. So this was a regular transportation corridor from 1883 on, and Galena City here was a central part of it. And this was as far north as mining took place in the Wood River Valley. And it was reported in 1883 that a contract was let for a person to carry mail from Galena City up over Galena Pass to the Sawtooth Valley. And in the wintertime, that was done on snowshoes in one day. The mail carriers would leave before dawn in the morning with a 40 to 50 pound pack on their back, go up over Galena Pass, go to the Sawtooth Valley mines, come back, and would be back in time for breakfast after hiking 13 miles, 6.5 miles each way. Not only did the arrival of the railroad bring a huge economic boom to the Wood River Valley, but there were grand plans being made to make Haley the transportation center of the valley, and branch rail lines were planned out to all the surrounding mining communities. And there were plans to extend the line from Ketchum up to Galena City to service the mines here. There were even plans to extend the Ketchum branch over Galena Pass or through Galena Pass with a tunnel, and to access the Sawtooth Valley mines. So they're making big plans in those days. Unfortunately, the intervention of the International Silver Depression that started in 1888 and lasted for a decade caused all those plans to collapse. In fact, the Silver Depression caused all the mines and the smelters in the Wood River Valley to close, and people left in droves. All of the small mining towns, including Galena, Gilman, Bullion, Muldoon, and a number of others, were abandoned and became ghost towns. The only surviving towns of Ketchum, Haley, and Bellevue existed as commercial centers, but there was no mining for at least a decade. And the Haley Times said in 1893, the Wood River Valley is deader than a lime fossil. That was really the beginning of the end, or the end of Galena City. Even by 1884 and 85, the mines weren't producing like the owners hoped they would. People started to leave. In 1886, I think it was reported that around 24 people voted in the election. So that was down from a population of 600 to 800. By 1888, there were only a few people here. The last remaining resident was Mr. Wilmuth, who owned and operated the single hotel and liver stable. Mr. Wilmuth died in 1890 in an accident, and is buried in the cemetery that's not far behind the Galena Lodge. And Galena City became a ghost town after that. And that was the end of mining in the North Valley for many years, and the end of Galena City. Now, what saved this part of the valley was the sheep industry. And that really saved not only the Wood River Valley and its economy, but the Oregon Short Line Railroad. The Gooding brothers came to the Wood River Valley in 1882 and originally had contracts to cut railroad ties for the railroad. In 1885, they brought some of the first sheep into the valley. And in 1887, they were the first people to trail sheep in the summertime over Galena Pass to graze and spend the summer there. And a number of other sheep raisers followed suit. And that kept a semblance of industry going in the Wood River Valley. It kept the Galena store going for a while, because it became a waypoint for all the sheep herders and the foresters that were going up and back. and that ultimately saved the economy of the whole region. In the late 1890s, there were roughly 2 million sheep in Idaho. And in the late 1890s, it's reported there were 324,000 sheep that were trailed over Galena Pass in the summer going up, or the spring going up, and the fall going back. And of course, in the 1920s, the sheep industry was so strong here that Ketchum and Hill City and Camas Prairie shipped more sheep by train than any place in the world, except for a few sheep stations in Australia. And one of the long-term significance of that industry is that without the sheep, the Wood River branch of the Oregon Short Line would have closed in the 1890s. And when Harriman sent his Austrian count to look for the perfect place for his new ski resort in 1936, it had to be on an existing Union Pacific line. So if the sheep hadn't rescued the Wood River branch, Sun Valley would never have been built here in the valley. This is the last remaining miner's cabin from the early glory days of Galena City. This is west of Galena Lodge and west of the Big Wood River, and it's not too far from the old historic Galena stage stop. And this is the kind of cabin, of which there are probably several hundred, back in the early 1880s. And this is the last one left, so appreciated its historic look. I'm sitting here on a cabin that was built by Charles and Pearl Barber in the late 1930s. They were running the lodge and store at the old Galena City site. And they actually developed it for tourism, and they built a series of cabins. This is on the west side of the Big Wood River, not too far from the Galena stage stop. And this is the one remaining tourist cabin that they rented out in the 1930s through the 1950s. It's reported that the first car drove over Galena Pass in 1916, and in 1919, federal funds were used to improve the highway. They regraded it, they reduced the grade, and that's when they put the first lookout into overlooking the Sawtooth Valley. It was still a very treacherous road and dangerous road and difficult. Very steep grades, narrow turns and switchbacks, and it was steep enough that the early cars had to back up. They didn't have fuel pumps in those days. They had gravity feed gas, and the pitch was too steep. If they went up forward, the engines would get no gas, so they had to back up. And the pitch was steep enough that the early cars, and certainly the wagons, oftentimes dragged logs behind them to slow down their trajectory coming down the pass. And the local ranchers and sheepmen called Galena Pass Hell's Own Pass. It was that tough. It was finally improved in 1926, and it was actually operated as a toll road until 1929. And it's been improved since then, but that's the original genesis of the existing highway now.